Hello, I'm Don Moyer from Moyer Marine. Today we'll be diagnosing and correcting 5 of the most common problems you're apt to encounter with Series 68 Zenith carburetors that were used on all Atomic 4 engines throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. The most current version of these carburetors is easy to identify by the fact that Zenith added a 5th bolt to hold the 2 housings together, it being located directly over the intake throat. Notice that this bolt is missing on the earlier versions. For the purposes of this video, we'll be assuming that you either have the most current version of the carburetor or an earlier version that's been upgraded with all the correct and most current jets and nozzles. If you've installed one of our service kits for the late model carburetor, you will already have all the correct jets and nozzles in your carburetor. The first, and to some small degree, the most frequently occurring of our 5 problems, involves raw fuel dripping from the intake throat of the carburetor, between the carburetor and the flame arrestor housing. There's a potential quick fix for this problem. You can remove the main passage plug, drain all the fuel from the carburetor into a glass jar. Then, while the carburetor is empty, the floats are down, you can operate a fuel pump, flush some fuel through the needle and seat of the valve, dislodge any dirt that's there, and restore its proper function. If the quick fix of flushing the float valve doesn't cure the problem, we'll need to clean the seat of the valve. To do this, you separate both halves of the carburetor and access the float valve by removing the floats and the needle, and then by taking a bluntly pointed 3/16 inch wooden dowel rod, you can press hard while rotating against the seat. This will make the orifice of the seat much friendlier to the small rubber tip of the needle and keep it from leaking. This is really the best long-term fix for a leaky float valve. Any dirt that makes it past the float valve sets the stage for our second most frequent call for help, which is when an engine won't accelerate smoothly from idle all the way to full power. A well-tuned Atomic 4 should accelerate almost explosively when flicking the throttle from idle to full power in that manner. Since the main jet is accessible by simply removing the main passage plug, a quick fix is possible by taking a can of carburetor cleaner and blasting the area of the main jet directly into the main jet orifice using the thin plastic tube. This will normally blast any tidbit of dirt through the main jet orifice and harmlessly into the inner well of the carburetor, thereby curing the acceleration problem. If poor acceleration continues after flushing the main jet through the main passageway, then the jet itself will need to be removed. Using a common screwdriver, you can turn the jet out, it being a screwdriver slotted little brass plug with a tiny orifice in the middle of it. You can then take the jet and a bristle from a wire brush and thoroughly clean the tiny orifice of the main jet. The jet can then be reinstalled. And the poor acceleration should be corrected. Now, any piece of dirt small enough to make it through the main jet will find the next smallest orifice in the idle jet, just several inches downstream. And yes, you guessed it, the third most frequent call for help is from someone whose engine won't idle properly. The engine will either stop completely when reducing power below 1200 RPM, or if it makes it to idle RPM, it will be so anemic that it will stall whenever you try to engage forward. In a case where the engine won't reduce power below 1200 RPM without stopping, the likely cause is almost certainly to be that the idle jet is almost completely blocked with dirt. The idle jet is located in the center of the underside of the upper housing, just behind the vertical throat, and it can be removed for cleaning as the main jet was. Once removed, we can, just as with the main jet, use a small wire brush bristle to thoroughly clean its orifice, using carburetor cleaner if necessary to help. And when it's thoroughly cleaned, it can be reinstalled. Now, it's very easy to damage the screwdriver slot in this tiny jet. So it's best to take a small to medium-sized screwdriver and customize the tip so it completely fills the rather wide slot on the tiny jet, like so. Now, there are some cases where an engine will come back to a reasonable idle RPM, but when it gets there, it's so anemic that whenever you put it into forward, the engine stalls. In those cases, the mixture is simply probably a little bit too lean. The mixture is controlled by this needle valve on top of the carburetor. This valve controls the air in the mixture, meaning that when you turn the valve in, you're attenuating the air to make the mixture richer. Turning it out, you're letting more air in to lean the mixture. If you don't know where the valve is currently set, it's best to turn it gently in against its seat and then back it out 3/4 of a turn to 1 turn, and then adjust it more fully once the engine is running for the best idle. An atomic 4 will also appear to be quite anemic at idle if the RPM is set needlessly low. The RPM at idle is adjusted by this set screw near the center of the throttle arm. Turning a set screw in will increase the RPM, and by turning it counterclockwise, it will decrease the RPM. You should shoot for an RPM which keeps the engine running when you are engaging forward. This will normally be around 800 RPM. Running in a not too distant fourth place in terms of likely problems is when the engine starts very hard, but then runs well after it starts. The likely cause of that problem is that the choke cable is not properly adjusted here at the swivel. A properly adjusted cable will be when it's pulled in the cockpit, the choke valve must be closed 100% so that the poppet valve will allow just the right amount of air to enter the intake for a good clean start. The fifth problem to make it to our list today involves engines running too rich. This manifests usually in sooty spark plugs, sometimes to the point of fouling, and higher than normal fuel consumption, meaning in excess of 1.25 gallons an hour. There are 3 things that can contribute to rich running having to do with carburetor function. The first is simply a richer than necessary idle mixture. If you're cruising at power settings at 1600 RPM or less, there is still sufficient manifold vacuum to draw some fuel through the idle system, which will add to that supplied by the high-speed system. The simple fix for this cause factor is to simply give the idle mixture an arbitrary quarter turn in the lean direction, meaning counterclockwise, and then use the engine as normal. If the idle remains strong at that setting, you might try a second quarter turn counterclockwise in the lean direction. Once again, if the engine continues strong at idle, you might try even a third. If you get to a point where the idle RPM suffers, then go back to the last setting that worked. We have frequent reports from the field where this simple technique has cleaned up sooty spark plugs and improved the fuel consumption noticeably. A second way in which carburetor function can affect richness in the mixture is when the well vent jet in the lower half of the carburetor becomes clogged with varnish or other contaminants. You may remember that the well vent jet is responsible for metering just the right amount of air to getting into the inner well and mixing with the fuel coming out of the main discharge nozzle. When that vent jet becomes clogged, less air goes through, hence a richer mixture out of the discharge nozzle. Now this well vent jet can be removed just as we did the main jet and idle jet for cleaning and reinstalling, and it should function normally. A third and final way that a carburetor can cause rich running in an atomic 4 is when an air breach develops between the upper and lower housings directly over the intake throat. This allows atmospheric air pressure to enter the inside of the carburetor and disrupt the normal air-fuel ratio being delivered up through the main discharge nozzle. This problem can typically only occur on the earlier style of these carburetors, which does not have the fifth screw in the front to keep the housings together. A good fix for this problem is to apply a good gasoline-resistant sealer around the front of the housings. This concludes our carburetor troubleshooting exercises for the day. Thank you for your attention. And hopefully, if any of these problems should visit you in the near future, you'll be well equipped to effect a timely fix.